Hello and welcome to Scilence, a podcast where women get really honest about surviving and thriving in what often feels like a man's world. My guests are wonder women from the fields of science, technology, engineering and mathematics, or STEM, where inclusivity and diversity can be a real issue. I know this only too well as a female Southeast Asian mechanical engineer. I'm kind of a minority within a minority. I'm Dr. Shini Somara, an engineer turned broadcaster. Throughout my career, I've worked on and reported on some cutting-edge technology and innovation. And through my TV work, I've met some incredibly inspiring women from a diverse range of STEM fields. Talking to these exceptional ladies has often left me feeling empowered, hopeful, and excited about life. I believe Scilence will enrich you too. Every week, a woman in STEM shares her unique experiences with absolutely no pressure in having to promote her accomplishments or guard her impressive reputation. Because I've come to realise that everyone is just way more open and relaxed when they're anonymous. So I've deliberately disguised my guest voices so that we're just connecting as human beings rather than human doings. It's my hope that you really relate to what we chat about today. If so, please do subscribe to Scilence and maybe even rate and review the show. I'd love to have your feedback. This week, my guest is in the field of medical physics. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show because I must admit that I have heard you speak live a few times and I've just found your story so inspiring. How did you get into medical physics?
So I think when I was younger, everyone told me I was going to be a doctor because I had an interest in medicine. And that, I think, stemmed from my mum, who's my sort of fiercest supporter and greatest role model, I think. She was a nurse, and I used to spend a lot of time in hospitals around her. And I know for a lot of people, the smell of a hospital is something that really scares them and is something that's not a natural comfort zone for them. But for me, it just reminds me of my mum. So I grew up loving the smell of hospitals.
That's so adorable.
And because I had an interest in science and an interest in medicine, everyone just directly went to you're going to be a doctor. And I wasn't quite sure myself if that was the right career for me. But because there wasn't any other visible career that combined those interests, that was the only thing that was really on my radar. When I was at school, I was lucky enough to attend an event called the London International Youth Science Forum. And this is an event that brings together students from all over the world for 2 weeks in London and exposes them to a range of different science topics. And during that event, I went on a visit to a hospital and learnt for the first time about medical physics when I was shown a brain imaging scanner. And that's when I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. I actually want to use maths and physics, not to do medicine, but to contribute to healthcare technology development.
Perfect. So marrying all your interests, assuming that you were good at maths and physics then.
Yeah, I was. I went to an all-girls school and I didn't really have a sense of how good I was, I don't think, because I think there were some really bright female students that I was alongside. And our physics class for our A-levels, there were 7 of us in our physics class and all girls, obviously. And we were all, I think, pretty bright looking back. We were all really motivated and enthusiastic. And I went to a Catholic convent school. So I was taught physics by a nun. And I didn't think that was peculiar either. And I didn't really have, since then, people have questioned, the whole link between religion and science. And because I was taught my physics by a nun, I don't know, it's all just, it's not ever really been an issue for me. So, yeah, I guess maths I love doing. I used to just do maths in my spare time just because I loved solving maths problems. And I was really excited about the possibility of sort of using that and for an output that was really tangible. I never really saw myself as a scientist that would be sitting in a laboratory in a back room. I wanted to see where the impacts of my science could be made. And that's, I think, one of the most powerful things that drew me into medical physics.
So how old were you when you were looking at that brain scanning stuff?
I was 17, so I
Gosh.
was in the summer between my A-level years, and it was, retrospect, it was a really critical time
Yeah.
for me because I think the other thing that was important in my story was that no one in my family had been to university.
Mm.
I grew up with two older brothers, which I think is sort of relevant to my story. Maybe we'll come back to that later on. And there was no expectation that I would go to university. Both my brothers had left school when they were 16.
Gosh.
And it was my chemistry teacher at one of my parents' evenings that said to my mum, I really think you should think about, your daughter going to university. Um, and so going to that event, the London International Youth Science Forum, not only just gave me the idea of medical physics, but it also gave me the confidence that I could survive in that sort of environment that I'd come across in university, and really gave me the confidence to apply for university, and not just for medical physics, but just to go away from home and go to university.
My gosh, it sounds like you were trailblazing on so many different levels, not just because you were probably a minority studying physics, but also because it sounds like no one in your family had blazed the same trail.
No, not at all. Both my parents worked. My mum's mantra to me, particularly, I didn't actually hear her say this to my brothers, but she said it to me all the time, was make sure you can be financially independent, and that will always give you choices in your
Mm.
life. And she was never prescriptive about what I should do, but she was very clear that I should have a career and that I should be able to earn my own money and have my own choices. So I just grew up expecting that that was what I was going to do. But I think the other thing that was great about both my parents was, even though I was very good academically, they didn't
Mm.
push me.
Yeah.
They let me go at my own pace. And in fact, during my A level revision, I remember really clearly my mother would call up my boyfriend and say, "You have to come round and take her out. She's doing too much
Oh,
studying."
wow.
So it was like the sort of completely the reverse,
Yeah.
of what you sometimes hear of, parents. It was completely the reverse of what you sometimes hear of parents in terms of, getting their kids to study. I think she was worried that I was becoming too academic,
Mm.
and that, I needed to keep that balance in my life. And I think that's something that stayed with me as well as I've moved forward in my career, just to make sure that work-life balance is, or juggle is constantly being reviewed, I think.
Mm. So were you born kind of geeky?
Yeah, I guess I was. My dad was really good at solving problems, and he was not a scientist, and but he was great. He was really interested in maths. He hadn't been able to continue his education as far as he wanted to, and so when I was doing my O levels, he sort of did the O level maths revision with me, and we used to sit down and work through maths problems together. And then when I went on to A level, he was like, "No, I think you've lost me now. I think that's I've reached my limit."
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I was my parents are really great at taking me to the museums, and I would just want to spend all my time in the science museum. I don't know if geek was a thing then, but I was. Yeah, looking back, I was geek.
Academic, certainly, because it sounds like you just loved
Yes.
solving problems and, I'm guessing that you were probably a very curious child.
Yeah, I remember having looking at a book that my parents had on their shelf, which was introducing the idea of the body, the human body as a machine. So each chapter dealt with like the communication center or the transport center of the body, or the waste disposal center. So it was like looking back now, it was like a bioengineering book. It was just in really understandable language.
Mm.
And so that I remember being completely fascinated by that book. And in my era, way before the internet.
I love the fact that you allowed yourself to follow your own curiosity, maybe because you didn't have that pressure from your parents. And so as a result, you could really navigate through STEM just by pure interest and passion rather than following a prescribed path.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis actually, because I never remember feeling pushed into anything. I just remember being allowed to follow my own interest and instincts. And I think that stayed with me through my career, actually, rather than
Mm,
following a prescribed route. Uh, and actually, when I went back after had been to this science forum and I went back to school and said that I wanted to study medical physics, some people were pretty horrified, actually, because they were like, "We've never heard of that. And what job would you end up doing?
mm,
And are you really sure you want to do physics as a degree? Because it involved me doing a physics degree." Um, and so, yeah, it was no one that I was talking to about this understood what I was doing. But I knew myself that that's what was, that's where I'd had my light bulb moment in
mm.
understanding that topic. So I guess I had to be pretty clear minded that it didn't really
Yeah.
matter what other people thought. I was just going to do it anyway.
Oh my gosh, we need to come back to that. But my thoughts when you were describing those 2 weeks that you spent uh, off curriculum, basically, um,
Mm.
was just so pivotal. And it sounds like those 2 weeks really allowed you to think outside of the box.
Yeah, so I guess, we are constrained as pupils at school by, the textbooks and the prescribed practical experiments that we do as part of the curriculum.
Mm,
And to be suddenly thrown into an environment where I was learning about cutting edge science and technology and engineering from the people who were doing
mm,
it, and then literally going into their laboratories and institutions and seeing it with my own eyes, it was like a whole different way of thinking about science. And also then to be in an environment where 24 hours a day you were surrounded by other young people who were massively passionate about science, um, in a way that I hadn't been before. Yeah, it was just mind blowing. And I often refer to that event changing my life. And that sounds very dramatic, but it absolutely did.
it makes one wonder about the approach we take in educating young people into STEM.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I'm reflecting back to an era pre-internet where accessing information for me was pretty much restricted to going to the library, or my parents had invested in, they couldn't afford them, I don't think, but they'd invested in the Children's Encyclopedia Britannica, which was our
Mm,
reference point for lots of the work that we did. Um, and so we didn't know at the time that that there was so much more information than we were able to have access to. And I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done to think about teaching and learning, in this era, where the way in which young people want to access information and can access information is completely revolutionized now. So
mm.
I think, as science educators, there's a lot that we should really be learning from young people about the best way of, engaging them with these topics much, much younger.
Yeah, we have to educate ourselves on how to educate young people, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I'm a great believer that, you know, um, my children's generation were born bilingual in technology in a way that I wasn't.
Mm,
So, for us to impose the metrics of both teaching and assessment that we're familiar with on them is just in many ways not appropriate, because the way in which they've come into this technological world is very
mm,
different to the way that we had to learn it. They just know it, just,
yeah,
which is an enormously powerful tool for them to have at their disposal to go off and be the next generation of scientists. And, it's going to be so impactful in the way that they're going to change the world. I'm an optimist, right? So I believe that they're going to do great things with that
yeah,
power.
yeah. I mean, I love the way you talk about it being a language because it really is. I mean, coding and various other languages in STEM are the new way of perceiving the world.
And if we just think about maths, I've always, I guess right from the beginning, thought about maths as the language of, particularly of physics. In many ways,
Mm.
quantum mechanics is a good example. You can only really properly explain quantum mechanics through the language of maths. And having, your eyes open to that really early. And for this, younger generation, just having them not being afraid of it. I remember being
Yeah.
afraid of technology, thinking, am I going to be able to code? Am I going to be able to work a computer? Do I really understand, the internet and each new language that came on? And, whereas I just think they're so much less phased by all of that than we were.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sort of my generation is probably very intimidated by all the topics of quantum computing and machine learning and deep learning and things like that. It just sounds so
Mm.
foreign. But to younger generations, they can easily wrap their head around it because it is a completely different way of
Yeah,
thinking.
and they're used to handling, they don't really realize they're doing it, but they're used to handling pretty massive amounts of information on a daily basis and data.
Mm,
They're used to
yeah,
sharing files all the time with each other and videos and photos and having instant access and understanding bandwidths and where they're going to get the best signal and, how they're going to converge lots of
yeah,
information in something, that might only last 90 seconds, but you grab someone's attention. They've learned those
right.
skills along the way, and
Yeah.
I think that's extremely powerful for them.
So something that is timeless is caring about what other people think of
Yeah.
us. How have you handled that? Because you seem to have really been encouraged by your parents to become responsible for your own decisions.
Yeah, I think I learned an awful lot from my mother, who has quite a strong character. And I think she instilled quite a lot of confidence in me. I didn't quite realize necessarily at the time. Um,
Mm,
I think, everyone doubts themselves, and we can doubt maybe sometimes the way that we go about doing things, but we can't keep doubting the path that we're on. Does that make sense? Like, you can say, for example, I want to study, medical physics, and that's my passion and my interest. And even though lots of people might be deflecting me from that, I know that
mm,
that's what I want to do. But that doesn't mean that along the way you don't doubt, have I chosen the right degree? Have I chosen the right university?
right.
Is this the right next step for me in terms of, a PhD? Should I be getting experience in, this institution or that institution? But the central path that sort of pulls you through all those decisions, I think that's the thing that I've never doubted that. I've just never doubted that I love this topic.
Mm.
Um, but that doesn't mean there's not been a lot of uncertainties along the way.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely crucial, really understanding that difference because let's just say, for example, you decide to study physics. You can choose to study physics, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy just because you've chosen to study physics. And I think when you have those challenges along the way, it's powering through those challenges, knowing that even though it is challenging, it doesn't mean that it's wrong.
No, and even though other people, they can impose sometimes their insecurities on you. So I
Mm,
remember really clearly people saying to me, you actually going to do a physics degree? Like, that's really hard. Like, that's the hardest degree that you could do.
mm,
I didn't feel like that myself, because if someone had said to me, you have to do a degree in the history of art, I would have felt sick in my stomach, thinking I can't
can't do
think of
that.
anything harder to do, because
Yeah.
that's just something I would find incredibly difficult to do. Or if I had to learn a language, right,
Mm,
that would be a massive challenge for me. I don't think my brain is wired particularly well in that direction. But for other people who may be insecure about their abilities in maths and physics, they can sometimes superimpose those things on you.
right. Yeah.
And so you have to just be really clear in your own mind and think, no, 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 from your perspective, it looks difficult. From my perspective, it looks like something I'm really willing to throw myself into.
Mm. So I guess by the age of 17, or around about, or I guess leading up to that pivotal moment when you decided what you wanted to do, um, you were really asking yourself what your purpose is, I guess.
Yes, I was. So I guess the other thing that might be relevant here is that I come from a family who all have worked in the emergency services. My Both of my parents and both of my older brothers were working in the emergency services and did for their whole careers. They're all retired now. So I guess I grew up with a sense of there is a purpose to what we do, and what we do can impact other people very directly. There was a
Yeah.
sort of joke in our household that when the phone rang, you'd pick it up and go, which service do you require? 999, which service do you require? Because we had all of them
Mm.
represented in the household. So I think that was probably where the doctor thing came from, partly, you know.
Mm.
So I never really.
And also this sense of life and death.
Yeah, and sort of the fact that you can make a difference. I really, really remember my parents coming home. They were both on shift work, and then my brothers when they were at home also. And they'd come home and they wouldn't necessarily always talk about what they've been dealing with during the day, but I got the sense that, there were pretty big things that they were dealing with, and they had to just get on and deal with them, and that had an impact on them sometimes that I saw. But that you equip yourself, you train yourself, and you go in and you do your very best in what can be sometimes very difficult situations. So
Mm. It's really fascinating to hear you speak about your childhood because I really get a strong sense of your self belief. And it must have come, you know, at least in part, from the way you were nurtured.
yeah, I think also there's something in there about having two older brothers who were very pretty strong characters and quite they were very close in age, and
Mm.
it was probably the classic, I was the annoying little sister, and if I didn't hold my own, my voice
Mm.
wouldn't be heard.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I was used to making my voice heard and having my opinion noticed. Otherwise, I would have got pretty drowned out, I think. So,
Mm.
but I do also think that as part of that, my mum was pretty good at, stopping the conversation to allow my voice to be heard. So
Mm.
I think that looking back was really important. She was never someone that said, "Oh, just be quiet," or just let everyone else have their say. She'd be like, "No, what do you think? What's we want to hear your contribution."
Mm.
So I think that probably did give me a sense of my own voice and a sense of my own opinion being important.
Mm. Gosh, she sounds absolutely epic as a mother, I must say.
Yeah, she's pretty extraordinary, and also the other thing that she remains to this day is incredibly optimistic about young people, and really sort of that sense of empowering young people to sort of be who they can be. I still
Mm.
see that now with her. All of our extended family, they go to her for so many different reasons, counsel and opinion and sort of support, and she's just such a huge cornerstone of the family.
Mm. So, how did her influence and your experiences um, help you in dealing with being a minority, as in, one of very few women in physics?
So I went from this environment in school where there were seven of us studying physics and we were all female, to going to university, and there were 110 students on our undergraduate physics degree, and 10 of us were female.
Wow.
And yeah,
Huh.
so that was a shock in one way. Um, but I think the other thing was that when I had been at school, just having, again, my older brothers and lots of their friends coming round, I was, pretty happy in male company. It wasn't something that I was pretty used to, being around boys my own age or slightly older. Um, but I did start to think, oh, every people are looking at us differently, like we're the girls in the room in inverted commas. And I thought, why are they? I can honestly remember thinking, why are they doing that? That's like a really odd reaction, that they're looking at us differently because we're girls.
You were thinking they were strange
Yeah, and
rather than you were strange.
exactly. I thought their reaction was strange, and then I guess that's when I realised, oh right, okay, so this is what sexism feels like, because they're looking at me differently only because I'm a woman.
Mm. Did it
Um,
make you self-conscious?
it did. It made me self-conscious about thinking that my performance then was going to be judged more acutely than if I was a boy.
And it
Because
must have been quite a stark contrast because you came from an all-girls school to that
yeah,
environment. So,
yeah, and I never had any sense of prior to that. You just did your best and you got congratulated or rewarded on how well you'd done. Whereas I think I picked up pretty quickly that perhaps my best, I was going to have to be better than a lot of the boys to really be noticed as being good.
right.
And I remember thinking that was just ridiculously unfair. And also, it was my first taster of visibility and that has stayed with me through my whole career, in that if you're a minority, you're visible. Some people think you disappear. I've never felt that. I felt like if I'm in a meeting and I'm the only woman,
You're
um,
glaringly obvious.
it's glaringly obvious. Just and people remember your name because you're not Dave, Steve, Pete, John, Paul. You're the one female name in the room, and everyone just remembers that name, right?
Mm.
So, and I remember that when I was a student, thinking, uh, there's that sort of lens that focuses on your achievement in a way that I hadn't really felt before, and because I hadn't ever had that from my parents,
Yeah.
I started to think, oh my God, now I'm, this sort of peer
Yeah.
pressure, if you like, is coming on me that I'd never really had. So I didn't have that at school. I was very lucky in retrospect. I never had that at school. Yeah, so I think that was when I started to realize that it was going to be different for me.
But it sounds like it boosted you rather than kind of cut you down.
Yeah, I don't remember being sort of shrunken by
Mm.
it. Shrunk by, is that right? Shrunk by it. I just remember thinking, I want to do this still. I really want to do this. I want to do medical physics, and I'm going to have to get this degree to do this. Um, and yeah, I just thought, well, we're just going to have to dig in and do it. And I remember becoming a staff student rep. You get these staff student consultative committees, and I volunteered to be the representative for our cohort. And I think I found that quite useful. But then I realised early on that, and this is still true now in my career, that if you become somebody who sort of goes outside the pure academic route, and you start taking on like what I would call an enabling role in that sense, you're thinking about how can we best represent the views of the students, and think about the sort of student community more broadly. Then people immediately cut you down and say you can't be very serious about your academic work then if you're spending time
Mm.
doing that. you know so that was my
Yeah.
first taster of that sort of cut down.
Yeah.
This constant judgment of your worth and proving that you must be completely dedicated to your academics, and anything that you do outside of that, you know automatically dilutes that academic work that you're
Mm.
doing, which is the most crazy, perspective, I think, but it's very real. Um,
How have you managed to deflect those judgments?
I think because, again, I was brought up with a sense of balance, that it wasn't academics at all cost. There are other things in your life, and those things are really important. And again, God, it's amazing how I'm surprising myself at how constantly I'm referring to my mother, but it's true. So the other thing she always sort of said to me was, no one's indispensable. You could give your life to your job, And when you retire, pretty soon people will forget that you were there. They might not forget what you did, but they'll get over the fact you're not there anymore. And if you got run over by a bus tomorrow, they get on with it without you. So make sure you have a balance in your life where you're not giving everything to one part of your life. And so I guess I got through that by thinking, well, this is what I think I need to keep balance in my life.
Right.
And so
Is that it's a bit like that concept of put your own oxygen mask on before helping others.
yeah, that's a really good analogy, and that sense of you're the only person that really understands your own well-being and what you need to feed that well-being. And again, it's a bit like people judging my degree, choice of degree. That they're looking at it entirely from their own perspective, and if they start to judge how I spend my time, that's also from their perspective. But I know what I need to keep healthy, body and soul and mind. And that's actually knowing that, and that does not come overnight, right? You stumble and you fall and you make lots of mistakes and you burn out and you have real sort of crashing self-doubt. All of those things are part of learning what do I need to keep myself in a good place to be able to deliver on all of the different fronts that I want to be able to deliver on.
Yeah, I must say your words are so inspiring, because I think some people listen to others because they don't want to come across as being selfish. But I
Mm.
don't get a sense of you being selfish at all. In fact, I just hear you as being utterly selfless, in the sense that you are giving your career everything in order to help other people.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I'm in the lucky position that I love what I do. And so, the idea that I can do that and that hopefully it has positive benefits for others is really good. I think this touching on this idea of being selfish and selfless is interesting. I think it's okay to be selfish if that enables you to protect the part of yourself that needs nurturing to enable you to do the bigger things you want to do. So I've learned that it's okay to say, I'm really sorry. I'd love to say yes to your invitation, but on that day, I won't be at work and I'll be doing something else, because I know that I'm going to need to do that so that I keep the balance in my life to say yes to all the other things that I might be asked to do. So in that moment, it feels pretty selfish, right? But I think if you just, balance it out and, think about the bigger picture, you need to be able to be selfish in those moments. And, I'm often mentoring early career scientists, and particularly female scientists. And I say to them really clearly, there are parts of your career, pivotal parts of your career, where you have to be selfish. You have to start thinking, what am I doing, over a 3 or a 6 or a 12-month period that will deliver for me what I need to go to the next stage of my career?
Gosh, I don't know about other women listening to this, but I just huged a massive sigh of relief hearing you say that, because it is a balance, and there can often be so many spinning plates. And you know in terms of your own life, you sound like you're spinning a lot of plates. I mean, you mentioned motherhood. How have you managed to balance all of that?
Well, I think pretty much the same way as lots of other people do, which is I heard someone say this, it's not a balance, it's a juggle. I don't think my life is ever really in balance. I think it's just whether how well I'm juggling at that particular time. I think striving for balance is actually like really difficult, because you feel like you should be in balance, right? And you should feel
Mm,
that calmness of that balance. And I think I'm constantly in that state of, juggling, of thinking, let's just make sure, we're as close to balance as we can be at any point in time. So in terms of motherhood, I made the decision that I would work part time. So when I was pregnant with my first child. When I pretty much about the time I found out I was pregnant with my first child, I found out that I'd been
Gosh.
awarded a fellowship. And I was, like, oh, okay, so this is the way life is gonna play out right now. And I wanted to get pregnant. I was really clear that at that stage of my life, I wanted to have a child. Um, and I negotiated a return to work on the basis of going back part time. And at that point, in the process of that negotiation, I was told that the funding council that had given me the fellowship, that they hadn't had to have that negotiation with anyone else. I was the first person to negotiate, having the fellowship on that basis. And so I guess I went into the negotiation thinking I'm going to ask for everything I could possibly want. And then, I'll start at one position, they'll start at another position, and we'll negotiate into some middle position. And pretty much they just accepted my first sort of
Amazing.
proposal and said, yeah, okay. So, if you don't ask, you don't get, I guess. And so that enabled me to go back to work part time. So I worked part time actually for 18 years. So I had another child. I worked 3 days a week to start with, and then 4 days a week. And I managed to get promoted to professor whilst I was working part time, even though I was told I wouldn't. I did.
And were you actually working part-time, or were you working physically part-time but actually full-time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Everyone always asks me that. So again, just for context, this was before the internet. I guess the email was just coming online. Certainly no emails on my phone. So if I was not at work, the only way I could connect to my email was through a dial-up modem, which was a pretty painful. You had to be pretty keen to check your email if you had to go through a dial-up modem. So it was a different era. So it was easier in some ways to just cut off from work on the days when I wasn't working. But the caveat that I would always place on that is that I was well aware that just because I was working part time, my deadlines didn't shift, right? The deadline was still the deadline. I didn't get extended deadlines for grant applications or, deadlines for submissions for papers. And so there were times when I just worked through the night to meet a deadline. But then I would take the time back. I would be really conscious of saying, right, I'm going to take that time back to make sure that over the course of a week or 2 weeks, I am still working part-time hours. Because, again, a lot of people said to me when I said I'm going to go part-time, I had a huge number of naysayers saying you'll end up being paid part-time, working full-time. People will automatically think you're not serious about your science. And you just won't progress in your career. And again, I guess I was sort of pretty single-minded at saying, yeah, but I want to work part-time, so everything else is just going to have to, if those are the consequences, I'll just have to manage those because I'm not going to change my perspective of working part-time.
Gosh, I mean, it's so amazing what opportunities open up when you really love what you do.
Yeah, and maybe I'm sounding pretty bloody minded, aren't I? Like I would just say I'm going to do this and sort of, to hell with the consequences. It wasn't quite like that. I think I just knew where my limits were in some ways. I hugely admire women that work full time, right? I just, my husband has always worked full time in a very busy job. There's the whole commuting thing in there. And I just don't think when my kids were really young, I could have done that 5 days a week. It just wasn't for me. And I was fortunate to have a really supportive family around me, and financially as well. I could afford to work part time. So that is not a choice for every woman. And, the costs of childcare and traveling. I know for the first few years when I went back to work, I was bringing home no money. All of the money that I earned went into traveling and childcare. And I remember thinking then, I'm playing the long game here. I'm not going back to work to earn money at this point. I'm going back to work to keep my career options open.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I mentioned, the opportunities that one has when they really love what they do, in the sense that, or when you have such a great expertise in something, it really allows you to open doors, particularly in academia.
Yeah, it does. I think, we become quite niche, don't we?
Mm,
I was able to pursue an interest in a particular technology, and at a point where that technology was really rapidly developing and finding new applications. So it was a really exciting time to be involved in the evolution of that technology. So I was lucky in that sense. I think that I was the timing of my entry into that particular area of research was really good. Um, I think also I was really hugely supported by male colleagues, and I always say this because I think it's, for someone like myself, where there were virtually no women doing what I did at that time, I couldn't
mm,
rely on a female support network. The only people I could rely on to support me professionally were men. And I always, when I look back now and I hear some of the stories of, what colleagues and, early career researchers are dealing with now, it just makes me even more grateful of the supportive male colleagues that I had.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, because relationships with men at work is a really complex thing. I mean, women have all kinds of layers of confusion when dealing with men professionally. What was your experience like?
I think, again, I'm coming back to sort of having had two older brothers,
Mm,
and I had lots of male friends at university by virtue of the course that I was on. So I am quite comfortable around men in that sense. I think, and I guess what I felt as I progressed in my career was the difficulty I felt was when you become, for example, the only woman in the room and you're chairing the meeting. That dynamic is interesting, right? So
mm,
you're then presented with a room full of men, and even if it's unconscious bias or not, you don't know how they're going to respond to suddenly having a woman, well, not suddenly, but at that point having a woman,
mm,
leading them, and really, you know being the voice that's, steering the strategy and the vision for what we want to do. And not all the men that I work with like that. So that was a struggle. But I think, just I guess I have understood men from the perspective of, being,
growing up
friends with
around
lots
them.
of men, growing up around them, and
Yeah.
yeah. And my dad's a very even guy. He's a very even, fair guy, and
Mm.
yeah. So, but yeah, there's definitely been, there's been plenty of instances where I've, come across individuals and they just, there's been some blatant sexism where they just do not like being told what to do by a woman, for want of a better word, So,
Yeah.
and they will demonstrate that dislike in a range of different ways. They can just be disruptive in a meeting. They can be deliberately sort of obtuse, or can be doing things behind your back that you don't realise they're doing.
But it sounds
Um,
like you had the tenacity to push through that and overcome it.
yeah, I think what I have tried to do, but it's not always been easy, is to work out who your allies are, and it's really, really important that you understand who they are, and acknowledge that their support is going to be really important for you. But also, wherever possible, just call out the bad behaviour. Now, that's not easy to do,
Mm,
and one of the things that I look back on and think I wish I had been much better at was coming up with a quick reply, to an inappropriate comment or bad behavior
mm.
in the moment that it happened. And I still really struggle with that even now, because I feel like after the event, I think of all the things I should have
Yeah.
said. But in the heat of the moment, I'm in that zone of, this has happened to all of us, I'm sure. It's certainly happened to me when I've chaired meetings, when I've about to give a talk at a conference or been part of a panel. So they can be quite public. examples of where somebody's behaved badly or said something inappropriately, and you feel in that moment, because you're not expecting it always, sometimes it just comes out of the blue, and in that moment there's a huge weight of responsibility
Yeah.
on you. And what you want to do in the ideal world, in the sort of movie version of your life, right? You want to have the quick, insightful, precise quip that serves to put down the comment and neutralize its impact, not just on you, but on the entire audience, and make the guy feel really small, right?
But the
And that's
reality,
incredibly hard to do. And the reality is that you have a choice. You either have to take some of your mental energy to work out what that could be, what the quip is, or you think, I'm here to chair this meeting, to give this talk, to contribute to this panel, and actually that's my major job, and I'm going to actually make sure that my mental effort is not diverted
and
from that,
basically keep the peace.
um, and keep the peace. And and yeah, and it's hard. I mean, I I can think of lots of examples where, I wish I'd have had that quit, but in retrospect, the one thing that I did do was I didn't let it put me off my stride for what I was there to
Yes,
deliver.
because I think
Um,
when we are presented with a situation like that, we actually don't want to be confrontational, because in my experience, I don't want further abuse. By being confrontational, you
no,
open yourself up to harder knocks. And so I'd rather not run that
yeah,
risk. And so I'd rather just stay
yeah,
mute and just keep it all fair and quiet than actually speak up for myself. And that's when I go home and just think, God, I really should have said X, Y, and Z. But yeah, it's really, yeah,
but it's
really hard.
hard. It's really hard, and often I found it in situations where there's already a heightened sense of focus and concentration which you need for the things that you're doing, and you if you let that go, the worry is that you're going to fail at delivering what you're there to
Mm,
do, and I don't think you ever
yeah.
really win if you, like just what you say, if you open up the conversation that
Mm.
doesn't deserve any oxygen. Um, and but it's hard, and I still struggle with that now. I still struggle with how I advise others to deal with those situations. And still, if it happens to me, just thinking, oh, I should be much better at this by now.
Yeah. I think it's a massive difference between women wanting to be like men and women actually being proud of being women.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I don't think women are naturally confrontational. They can still be assertive and get what they want, but not in the same way that men get what they want.
Yeah, I think there's an ego thing in here, and it's desperately stereotypical, right? Just to sort of
Right.
say,
Yeah.
that
We are talking in umbrella terms here.
exactly, but, it's hugely relieving to walk into a room of men that I know well and know me, and we just all know that the egos are left at the door, right? It's
Yeah.
just, we're
There's
just
a
there to do
respect for each
business.
other
Yeah,
and our
mutual respect.
approaches.
And the other thing I think that's really important here is that I've always worked across disciplines. So, I've worked between clinical and life science teams and physical science teams,
Mm.
and everyone has their own
Strengths.
yeah, their specialism based ego. It's like,
Yeah.
um, and I think that, for really good collaborative work, you have to just let that go at the door as well. You just have to sort of have a mutual acknowledgement. We've all passed lots of exams. We've all got letters after our name. We've
Mm.
all done X, Y, and Z. But none of that is actually important for what we have to do in the next hour and a half, which is to come up with the strategy for moving this project forward. Um, and I've those are the situations at work that I really thrive on. I think when where everyone is just
Mm.
focusing on what we need to do to move things forward rather than who's in the room. um,
Yeah. I mean, as a woman in physics, then, medical physics, do you feel like there is this unconscious bias then towards women? And if you do feel that that exists, um, do you think, I don't want to say men, I don't want to stereotype men, but Do you think attitudes need to change?
Yeah, so we had an interesting conversation just in the last few weeks around events that we're currently planning and running to support women in our own department and faculty, where we just assumed as a group of women that men got that there were these issues. They understood that it can be pretty intimidating for a woman to walk into a room full of men. Someone gave an example of walking into a committee where there were 40 men and she was the only woman, or of, chairing a meeting where you're the only woman in the room. And then we were unwrapping these conversations with some male colleagues, and they were like, "Yeah, but that's not a thing for you, is it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no, that is a real big thing, right? You really, yeah, no, that is a real thing.
Yeah.
You have to take a few deep breaths to do that." And they're like,
Yeah.
"Really?"
Oh my
Because they
gosh.
see women do it, and they
Mm,
think, "Oh, well, that must be okay for them because they've come in,
'cause
they've
they're doing
performed
it.
really well, and they're good, so therefore." And what they don't see is the anxiety
Mm,
that you can have before you have to do those things, while you're doing them, and then the whole download afterwards, where you go over the conversations or the things that you've done and think, could I have done that one way? Could I have done that one way? I'm not saying men don't do that, but the whole added layer of being, in a minority in the room. And so we've decided that we're not, we need to discuss these things more openly rather than just making them look easy. Does that make sense? Rather than making them look like, oh, we see that that's a problem, but we're going to work through it.
mm.
We've really got to say,
Get it
no,
out in
this
the
is a
open.
problem. Get it out in the open, and actually bring men into the
Right.
conversation and give them practical suggestions without being patronizing, but give them practical suggestions for just how they can make that situation easier.
Mm. Do you think we'd come across as moany though if we say, "Yeah, it's pretty intimidating"?
Yeah, I know. It's a really delicate
Yeah.
balance of, you don't want to just keep moaning on about things. Um, but equally, you want people to understand where the differences are. And, the whole conference, I've been to some conferences, there's a particular type of conference that's in my discipline where the whole basis of the conference is based around a sort of, I would say, a 1950s ethic of how you could get men all together, and the way in which the accommodation is set up, and the sort of the hours of the conference, and also all the events and all the activities outside of the conference in terms of the non-academic activities, but just very male based, I think, in fact male focused. And I've been
Mm.
to a couple of those conferences and I felt really uncomfortable, and I thought, why does this conference feel so uncomfortable? And I just thought about the sort of genesis of that type of conference and thought, because it has been set up by men for men. And I don't think
Yeah.
they're doing that to exclude people. They just don't realize that it's just not very inclusive and it makes other
Right.
people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, that's describing many aspects of our society, that it's been set up by men for men.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I'm much more sensitive to that now than I ever used to be. I think I do have to admit that I think that during part of my career, I remember thinking I'm just going to keep my head down and just
yeah.
do what I can to keep moving forward. And in
Mhm.
retrospect, now I probably had some male behaviours. Right, I was probably becoming more male in my behaviour because that was the environment that I was working in, and I maybe that was the easiest way to get things done, or
Mm.
to be respected, or to be heard.
But
And I look now and think, no, that is not the way this should be done. And only
mm,
the other day, someone said to me, these are the metrics for academic success and blah, blah, blah. We need to make sure people understand these. And I'm like, no, we probably need to rewrite the metrics, actually. That's
yeah.
probably what we need to do.
I mean,
Um,
whatever male characteristics you may have adopted to succeed in your professional career, thank God it hasn't actually stopped you doing very womanly things like becoming a mum.
well, yeah. And I don't consider myself, I don't think my friends, male or female, would consider me, like, uh, you know, a very male type woman. Does that make
Yeah,
sense? This is just a
masculine.
really weird way of putting it, but do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Um, So yeah, but I think that's also sort of part of knowing yourself, right? That
Yes.
you need to know the things that enable you to keep that
Mm,
balance. Um, and just knowing that if you have a day, I mean, if I have days where I'm chairing meetings or I'm doing things that I really feel are going to take a particular amount of energy, of that type of energy from me, I will make sure that I have something that will balance, some
yeah.
sporting activity or some other thing that I do that will allow me to just unwind from all of that. So I don't bring all that
Mm,
home with me, because that's not very pleasant, I think, for everyone around
yeah.
you at home.
I mean, this question might be a bit woo-woo, but I'm going to ask it anyway. um,
Go for it.
some people listening may not have like maybe supportive parents or just people that they can lean on. Um, how would you suggest developing a strong sense of self?
Gosh, that's a really hard question. I think there's, I don't know, uh, there's something about vulnerability in there, which is a really awkward thing for people to want to discuss.
Mm,
And I think you have to sort of start understanding your vulnerabilities to understand the things that you need to strengthen you. Does that make sense?
right.
So
Yeah.
if you feel that you need to think about your sense of self, what is it about yourself that it unsettles you, and so you have to sort of go to that place in yourself and think about
Mm,
the stuff that none of us want to think about, which
mm,
is the things that we don't think we're particularly proud of or we don't do particularly well. um, and just sort of own them a little bit,
yeah.
and think, let me, like, if it was if it was a scientific experiment, you'd look through the methodology of your experiment and say, yeah, we really could do better in this area, of measurement, or we could do better in the way in which we're analyzing, or you'd lay it all out and say, right, if we're going to do this experiment again, this is where we can strengthen our
Mm,
methodology, right? It's almost like you need to do that. You need to be brave enough to just lay it out and just admit that there are some areas where you you could do with a little bit more work on yourself.
so an example of that could be if you're a physics female student and you feel really uncomfortable speaking up about your answers, then
Mm,
explore that. You know, push
yeah,
yourself to speak up,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah. So I was speaking at a pretty big event the other day, and the person who was introducing me, who was female, um, had said that she'd stayed up, a lot of the night before, because she had to read my biography out and she had to make an introduction, and then she was chairing the questions
Mm,
afterwards. And she, because I saw that she was a bit nervous, and I said, I'm really nervous too. I'm really nervous. And she said, yeah, but I had to stay up all night making sure. I said, yeah, I stayed up quite late last night making sure that I got my slides right, and that I got my story for my talk together, and that I thought about the possible questions I might get. And she said, oh my God, I can't believe that, we were both up at the same time worrying about the same event. And I thought, you're so much more experienced than me. And I'm like, no, no, I realize that I get nervous before I do
mm,
public speaking. And I know that the way that I can really moderate those nerves or manage those nerves is by dedicating a good amount of time
yeah.
to preparation, and that I know that for me, that helps, contain my nerves. So I've just realized that that's what I need to do. So, I said, for you, it was a really positive thing that you stayed up last night and really practiced doing what you would have to do on stage, because hopefully you do feel more comfortable
Mm,
about doing it now. So,
yeah.
um, but if we constantly have these role models where we just see people succeeding all the time, getting up and make everything look effortless, I think it's just massively intimidating for early career scientists, that they can't imagine that they're ever
Mm,
going to feel like that. So showing a bit of vulnerability in yourself and saying, yeah, this is tough, I'm nervous, I need to prepare for this. It's not just a walk in the
uh,
park,
I
it's quite
absolutely
helpful.
couldn't agree with you more. And it's just been an absolute pleasure listening to your honesty and your vulnerability, actually. in everything we've discussed over this hour. And I've learned so much from you. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story with us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
That's it from my STEM guest this week. Gosh, what a key message of knowing yourself and learning all about yourself. My guest this week has really inspired me and given me the motivation to keep going and really understanding who we are, because in getting to know yourself, you can really approach your life with passion and authentic interest in what you do, and the sky's the limit if you're able to really live that kind of honesty. Thank you so much for listening this week. Don't forget to rate and review the show, and catch you next week on Scilence.